Imagine a world where the Wi-Fi is down. Not spotty, down. Most people never see a book in their entire lives. News moves at the speed of a horse, and forecasting is half observation, half superstition. If you're looking at the candlelit scribes on screen, that's basically the bandwidth of the era.
Okay, you're painting a pretty bleak picture. I assume we're talking about the so-called Dark Ages?
That's the old branding. Historians usually prefer the Middle Ages, and they'll tell you Dark Ages is a loaded term, often used for the early part after the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. There were absolutely bright spots. Monasteries preserved texts, universities emerged later, and outside Western Europe, especially in the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, scholarship didn't exactly hit pause.
1,000-year slump? That feels like a long time to be buffering.
More like a long, uneven buffer. In parts of Europe, political power fragmented. Long-distance trade and literacy shifted, and a lot of knowledge lived in small pockets. Cathedrals, courts, monasteries. Books were hand-copied and expensive, so ideas didn't scale easily. Then, by the 14th century, especially in Italian city-states, you start seeing conditions change. Wealth, competition, patronage, and a growing appetite for learning. The server doesn't just reboot, it upgrades.
And this is where the Renaissance kicks in?
Exactly. It takes off in Italy, with Florence as one of the loudest engines, and the skyline on screen is a pretty good shorthand for that. This wasn't only better art, it was a new posture toward knowledge, often called Renaissance humanism.
Humanism. That sounds nice? But what does it actually mean in this context?
In Renaissance terms, it's an education and culture movement, a return to classical Greek and Roman literature and the studia humanitatis, things like grammar, rhetoric, history, moral philosophy. It didn't necessarily mean anti-religion. It meant placing more emphasis on human agency, critical reading, and what you can understand and build in this world.
So it wasn't just about marble statues and guys in tights.
Far from it. And yes, the statue on screen is the meme version of the Renaissance. But under the marble was a bigger shift. Curiosity as a virtue, not a vice. To see how fast that shift spreads, look at two accelerators. The platform that copied ideas, and a power user who treated every question like a doorway. Let's start with the platform. Mid-15th century. Johannes Gutenberg, a metalworker in what's now Germany, helps turn printing into a system. Press, ink, and durable, movable metal type. If you're looking at the wooden press on screen, that's the machine that changes the speed limit on knowledge.
I know this one, the printing press. But didn't people already have ways to print things?
They did. Woodblock printing had been used for centuries, especially in East Asia. Movable type also existed earlier there, including metal movable type in Korea. Gutenberg's breakthrough in Europe was an efficient package. Consistent metal type, a screw press adapted for printing, and inks that played nicely with paper and metal. For alphabet-based text, it scaled.
So he turned bookmaking from a craft into an assembly line.
That's the feel of it. Around the mid-1450s, Gutenberg's workshop produced the famous Gutenberg Bible. Roughly 180 copies is the common estimate. And the visual of that open, dense, two-column print on screen is the point. You're no longer limited to one scribe, one book, one year.
It sounds like the internet of the 1450s.
It's a fair analogy if we keep it honest. It wasn't instant, and literacy wasn't universal. But printing made replication cheap compared to hand copying. By 1500, presses had spread to hundreds of European towns and cities, and print created a faster, wider conversation. Pamphlets, manuals, sermons, arguments. The network effect arrived.
Enter the Ninja Turtle?
Enter the original Renaissance man archetype, Leonardo da Vinci. Born in 1452 near the town of Vinci, not far from Florence, He was born out of wedlock, something that closed certain professional doors in that society, including the neat family path into notary work.
How is that lucky?
Lucky is a simplification, but here's the twist. Instead of being funneled into a legal career, he's steered into a workshop world. As a teenager, he's apprenticed in Florence to Andrea del Verrocchio. Picture what that meant. Less lecture hall, more lab. Drawing, sculpture, metalwork, mechanics, pigments. The city panorama on screen is nice, but the real Renaissance engine was the workshop.
So he learned to be a mechanic and an artist at the same time?
He learned that the boundary was optional. Light on a face wasn't just art, it was optics. Muscles weren't just anatomy, they were levers and pulleys. That habit of cross-wiring disciplines is basically his superpower.
Okay, so he's in Florence, learning the ropes. When does he start doing the heavy hitting?
In the early 1480s, he heads to Milan, and he doesn't introduce himself as painter first. He sends Ludovico Sforza a letter that reads like an early resume. Bridges, fortifications, siege devices, engineering problem-solving, and, almost as an afterthought, also painting and sculpture.
He marketed himself as a defense contractor?
He marketed himself to the paycheck of the era. And in Milan, he produces one of the most analyzed images on Earth, the Last Supper, painted on the refectory wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie, generally dated to about 1495 to 1498.
I've seen pictures. It's crumbling, right?
It's famously fragile. Leonardo worked in a drywall technique rather than true fresco, layering paint onto prepared dry plaster so he could go slow and revise. The trade-off is right there on screen, breathtaking composition, and a surface that started deteriorating not long after it was finished.
And while he's painting this, is he still doing the science stuff?
Constantly. His notebooks are the real reveal, pages and pages of sketches, diagrams, observations. You can see that mindset in the notebook page on screen, part art study, part engineering draft, part what if. He often wrote in mirror script. The simplest explanation is practical. He was left-handed, and writing right to left can reduce ink smearing, though privacy may have been a bonus.
I've heard about the flying machines. Did he actually build them?
As far as we know, most of the flight concepts weren't built in his lifetime. What survived are the designs and studies, like the sketch-style flight notes on screen, attempts to translate birds into mechanics. Some ideas were visionary, some were probably impossible with the materials and power sources available to him.
It's wild to think about someone sketching a helicopter in the 1490s.
It's wild, and it's the humanist impulse in action. Observe, measure, model. Then, back in Florence in the early 1500s, he begins a portrait that becomes its own global icon.
The Mona Lisa.
The Mona Lisa. Probably Lisa Gherardini, a Florentine merchant's wife. And the on-screen portrait is a great reminder. This isn't just a smile. It's atmosphere, anatomy, optics, patience. Leonardo kept revisiting the work for years, and appears to have taken it with him to France late in life.
So he never really finished it.
Finished is tricky with Leonardo. He refined, reworked, and sometimes abandoned projects when the next question grabbed him. He died in France in 1519 at Clos-Lucé, near Amboise, after being invited there by King Francis I. There's a famous story that the king held him as he died. Beautiful, but likely legend.
So we have Gutenberg giving us the mass distribution of knowledge, and Da Vinci showing us the infinite depth of that knowledge.
Exactly. Printing scales the conversation. Leonardo embodies what happens when curiosity refuses to stay in one box. And together, plus a lot of other forces we're not even naming, this era helps propel Europe into the early modern world. So why does a 500-year-old glow-up matter now? Because the pattern rhymes. The visual shift on screen, from Renaissance workshop vibes toward modern tech, gets at it. New tools, plus new habits, can rewire what a society produces.
You mean history repeating itself?
Not copy-paste, more like the same mechanics showing up in new costumes. Big leaps often happen when three things intersect: a technology that changes the cost of making or sharing, a cultural shift in what's valued, and wider access to the tools.
Okay, let's break that down. The technology part seems obvious.
Right. In the 15th century, printing lowered the cost of copying and distributing text. Today we've got the internet, and now AI systems that lower the cost of producing drafts, images, code, and media. If you glance at the spread of print graphic on screen, it's the same idea. Distribution curves change everything.
I see the parallel. Gutenberg made it easy to copy a book. AI makes it easy to write one. Or paint one.
Exactly. The generative art moment in the 2020s is a clean example. Tools like Midjourney and DALL-E let people produce compelling imagery in minutes, work that used to require years of training to execute by hand at a high level. The on-screen Renaissance meets modern image is the point. The barrier shifts.
But isn't there a difference? Da Vinci spent decades mastering anatomy. Typing a prompt feels cheaper.
And people raised similar fears about printing, worries about quality, about floods of mediocre text, about losing the craft. The tool didn't end creativity. It changed where the skill lives. Sometimes the craft moves upstream, from brushstroke to composition, from copying to editing, from rendering to taste.
So we're in an AI renaissance?
Some people frame it that way. The safer claim is, we're in a period where art, computation, and science are colliding in new workflows. Very Renaissance in spirit, even if the politics and economics are totally different.
That's a cool way to look at it. The coder is the new sculptor.
And the sculptor is learning to code. When tools change, roles remix. That doesn't make specialists obsolete. It makes collaboration and cross-literacy more valuable.
So what's the lesson for us? If we're the new Renaissance citizens, what should we be doing?
Be Leonardo-ish. Don't stay in one lane. Learn enough outside your domain to connect dots. Art with math, biology with engineering, writing with systems. That kind of synthesis is what the sketch collage on screen is really celebrating.
Curiosity over specialization.
Curiosity, plus enough rigor to test your ideas. The Renaissance wasn't magic. It was institutions, patrons, workshops, tools, and a culture that increasingly rewarded inquiry. We've got tools Gutenberg couldn't imagine, and datasets Leonardo couldn't dream of. The only open question is whether we'll use them to copy noise or to build something worth preserving.
I guess I should go update my resume. Apprentice polymath has a nice ring to it.
It does. Just maybe skip the war machine section unless you really mean it. Though, yes, that tank-like sketch on screen is a reminder that genius is complicated. The Renaissance reboot is here. The question is what we choose to print, model, and paint on the wall.